Welcome to High Growth Matters, a podcast that explores topics on the minds of forward-thinking HR leaders and people managers, from leadership and strategy to emerging technologies. High Growth Matters is sponsored by OpenComp, makers of the world's first compensation software that gives you clarity every time you make a decision about pay. And it's hosted by me, Caitlin Allen, a startup executive with 3 exits under my belt, along with my co-host, Nancy Connery. Nancy was founding VP of HR and employee number 5 at Salesforce, and she now leads one of the most reputable HR advisory firms in Silicon Valley. She's also co-founder of OpenComp. Don't forget to give the show a 5-star rating as we dive in. So we are in the new part of a year, which means it is attrition season, and retention is top of mind for people leaders all over. And so today we're going to speak with Jamy Conrad about the science of helping top employees thrive and stay in seat longer by running a merit cycle process that is both transparent and empowering. Jamy is the Senior Director of People at TrustRadius, and she boasts an impressive track record of HR roles at tech and healthcare companies. So Jamy, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks, Caitlin. I appreciate that. Welcome.
Jamy, I second that. Thank you so much. We're very much looking forward to this conversation today. And in that vein, what's the one thing your coworkers don't usually know about you?
We got to kick it off with some of the harder questions, right? So I would say I started, one of my first paying careers was working in a hardware store in a small town. And I learned so much about DIY projects and home improvement and problem solving in general, and just listening to how people are going about solving problems. So that's probably my career goal too. When I retire from my HR professional career, I'll probably do something along the lines of working in a hardware store and helping people with their home improvement projects.
Love it.
That's awesome. I love those kind of anecdotes. They're good look under the hood, so to speak.
Yeah. You learn a lot, that's for sure.
Yes, absolutely. A well-rounded human.
Yeah.
Before we get into merit cycles specifically, Jamy, I think it would be helpful for our listeners to understand a little bit about the infrastructure that you have built at your team to make merit cycles excellent. And so maybe we can start with what your team looks like and what process you've gone through to get ready.
Well, I've got an HR manager that I work with, and then our CFO, who's amazing. He's a great support and helps keep us in line and on track, and takes care of all of those pivot tables that I love so much in Excel. But I think it's important to start, basic comp and how you go about running your merit cycle starts with having that really strong comp philosophy created and communicated. So, when we talk about compensation philosophy, for us, we try to do as much as possible to lean into our core value of transparency. And while we don't share all information about everyone's pay, and it's not, public knowledge, what we do try to make sure that we do is we've defined some of the core pillars of that strong comp philosophy: equal pay for positions, what all it takes into consideration from a total rewards and compensation, and not just base and variable comp. Mm-hmm. Geo influence on our benchmarking, and then an overall arching goal of how pay is less about being transparent with all the information, but more about defining, this is why you make what you do here at TrustRadius, and here are ways that you can go about making more. And I think that's the crux of what people want to understand anyway. And then my stance on all things when you're trying to build, we're building our HR department from the ground up. And so my stance whenever you're trying to build is start with just what's happening. What is going on? How are people making those comp decisions now? Document it and get it communicated out. Look, here's what's happening. then you can make those changes. Then you can make those recommendations. Here's what's happening. Here's why it may or may not be working. And here's why it may or may not be working in a specific position or a specific area. And you can make those adjustments along the way. We've got ours currently in our employee handbook. And then we've also made it part of our hiring process so that we're transparent about our comp philosophy from the very beginning.
That makes a lot of sense. And on that vein, how are you building, or how have you built, maybe is the better way of asking the question, your career leveling framework so that comp bands and comp philosophy gets applied in a way that's understandable through the lens of progression for employees?
Yeah, I think that comes down to job levels and pay grades and having all of that combined into something that managers and employees can comprehend and work with on a regular basis. The whole point of this is to make sure that we're able to produce outcomes from employees. And so we want to make sure that we're building it with the employees in mind. If you go through a process and you create something that managers and employees can't use, what's the point? So ours, I tried to take a real practical approach. We're still crafting and creating ours as we speak. Make it user-friendly and flexible so that it can be changed along the way. It doesn't have to be rigid. And then we want to make sure that whatever we put in place, that it's built on the competencies that we think will make somebody successful at our organization, so that employees and managers can then take that. And that's the most critical part, is that handoff, right? How are managers and employees gonna take that and run with it? We want to make sure that they can assess the current skill level. And then we want to make sure they understand what their opportunities are for growth. What are they trying to get to understand that gap analysis? Once you've understood the gap analysis, you can create your SMART goals and your OKRs to get you there, right? And build your roadmap. But the most important part, that's all the administrative part. Most important part is actually following through and communicating back and forth between the manager and the employee along the way. Candid feedback, real-time feedback. Here's my ideas. I'm running into these roadblocks, and having that two-way relationship for employees and managers to feel like they have the psychological safety, because they're in it together. They have to be partnered together.
Very true. It is a partnership. And I also do agree with, if you're going to go to the lengths of doing all this, let's do it right and absolutely follow through. And how do you, communicate the career pathways and offer, stretch opportunities to the employees?
I think that this is actually a disconnect in how we think about the whole process. Most people, when they think about career pathways, they think of it as an HR function, right? HR provides a career pathway. But in the reality of a small organization, that may work and be what's needed in large orgs. But most of the businesses that are needing these are smaller organizations. They're in real time. There are 100 employees, maybe give or take 50. And so it's really important for maybe HR to build a framework that's realistic, but it has to be driven by the leadership, the executive leaders, and those mid-level managers and directors, because they're going to be the ones that understand what's going to be needed in that profession and what it really looks like from a mentor and coaching standpoint. And then once the business leaders, they know and they understand that, then they can mentor and guide those frontline managers as well, because they're going to be the ones determining those stretch goals along the way. And it's going to have to be with the idea that you can be flexible and agile in the moment based off of the business needs. And so, again, it goes back to having that culture of psychological safety where you can have those conversations quickly and in real time.
One of the things that I feel like I see a lot, particularly with first-time managers, is that they're uncomfortable talking about performance, particularly right when there's some feedback that needs to be given. And I'm curious if you have any, unlocks or tips for how to train first-time managers on, the business value and, whatever words you want to put on it, the efficiency, the relationship building, the trust, the culture, the high performance that's built in those kind of interactions when someone's new to that kind of role.
I think the more you can do to take the subjectivity, to have them focused on what's objective, gives them more security if they can start with the metrics, if they can start with measurable goals, then that takes some of the emotional side of the fear out of those conversations. And so I always encourage those frontline managers, start with building your structured performance management mindset, right? Start with those metrics that you're going to be able to measure and point back to, and also make them, I don't want to say complex, but robust enough that it pushes the employee to grow and to feel like they're making an impact and difference when it comes to the vision and mission of the organization as a whole. So anything you can do, especially for those first-time people leaders, to take the guesswork out of it is going to make them feel more confident going into those conversations.
Yeah, like frameworks and role play, almost making it something that it becomes muscle memory and not just a new experience.
Right.
That makes sense. Well, great. Thank you. I got us a little bit off topic on that one, but it's something I'm always interested in hearing, just because I think it's such an unlock for organizations. We all have first-time managers. How then do you and your team approach running an effective merit process? Like this year, what's been your process up until this point, and what do the next couple of months look like?
So I would like to say that merit process has kind of been like the Wild West here since I started. There's some happening all the time. So I am very excited about the idea of structuring and formalizing an actual merit cycle for the company. The first, we're doing a performance cycle company-wide, Q1, and then merit cycle shortly after to start Q2. And so while we haven't run one yet at this organization, we are working very hard to prep for it. Things that we're keeping in mind to make sure that our prep work will lead to an effective merit cycle. We're going to be updating our benchmarking data. We've kind of been ad hoc with how we've done that in the past. So we're going to make a more structured process with that. We're going to make sure that any adjustments resulting from pay inequity, which are not any for us, thank goodness, but we'll do a double take once we get that new benchmarking. Make sure any pay inequity or pay transparency issues are adjusted for ahead of that. And then heavily train managers on those talking points. And don't forget, there's the admin side of it. So do we have the right comp technology, and we need to make sure that we audit everything before, during, and after if we decide to do it manually, and making sure we have the tools associated with that to be successful and reduce any errors along the way. I think that's really important too. Your comp cycle is really important. Your merit cycle is really important, especially if you only run one a year, which some organizations are still only doing one a year. And so you've got to get it right. You've got to put the time in.
Yeah. And I really think that what you just described really defines or describes some of the differences between a merit cycle that empowers an organization and, to use your phrase, the Wild West. So, so that makes sense. Maybe for some context too, Jamy, what's your location strategy for pay? Do you pay, based on a U.S. standard or by tiers?
So we were primarily Austin-based for the majority of the organization's lifespan. So we were using Austin first. If there wasn't enough data, then we were pulling national information in. And very, very rarely were we using geo-specific. Just recently, we decided to go remote first, remote fully. And so I think there's going to be a need to relook at that part of the compensation philosophy going forward. But as of right now, we've made the choice to run our headquarters as our main and national as our backup or secondary.
Great. And given the economy, the labor market, the new pay transparency laws that we are all, coming up to speed with, are there any special considerations you have in running, an amazing merit cycle specifically this year with all those, pieces in the mix?
if there's not one thing, it's another, right? You've got to take all those things into consideration. I'll actually steal an idea to answer this one. Your own head of people at Open Comp, Ashley Brownstein, and I were able to be on a panel recently together, and I loved her answer to this. And so I'm going to steal it openly and gratefully to her. But we plan to communicate and take on as much of the responsibility for that communication. There's a lot of considerations, like you mentioned, with pay transparency and labor market and economy and inflation and all of that. And so we want to make that part of the conversation that we as an organization have with the organization. So, whether that's our CEO or our CFO or myself, trying to give as much of context from the organization standpoint, so that when our managers come in to have those actual one-on-one conversations, there's less ambiguity about how we got to those numbers, how those numbers were presented. I thought Ashley had a great idea on that. And so I'm going to learn from her and take that and run.
Love that.
Yeah, we all need to do that from each other for sure. Maybe circling back to, we've talked on some of the things that can go well or that you're improving at TrustRadius. Perhaps a different look at the same coin. Where in your experience, and Nancy, maybe you can chime in here too, given your time and seat as a leader, where do merit processes go wrong? And then where that's consistent, where Wild West gets created, what can your team, or what does your team do to prevent those common missteps apart from what you've shared already?
I think empowering those managers to understand it is where a lot of companies, they gloss over it, right? They've got the budget, they know what they can and can't spend, and they may or may not have a structured performance management that influences comp, right? There's that decision that has to be made, but then they just gloss over, okay, managers, here's your budget, go. Right. And they forget to spend that time with those managers to making sure that they understand the why, and that managers understand how to say no, and here's why, right? And often that part of it gets forgotten about. And so a manager gets pushback from an employee about their merit increase amount, and the manager's kind of like, oh crap, I wasn't expecting this. What do I do now? And so, making sure that you spend that time with the manager so that when they have those situations come up, they know how to navigate those conversations, providing them with guidelines, providing them with talking points, providing them with the comp philosophy, providing them with metrics that are important to take into consideration when we talk about how to make a merit increase recommendation. And then also just, a lot of times, unfortunately, we see the person that yells the loudest gets more of what they want, even if it's not budgeted or appropriate or supported by data. And so feeling comfortable, having managers feeling comfortable on how to navigate those sometimes squeaky wheels in an appropriate way.
Yeah, I think
sometimes they're right, sometimes they're not.
Very, very much so. The investing in the training up front, and as you said, Jamy, making sure that they're prepared to have those difficult conversations, because these conversations don't always go the way that they're supposed to go. I think for a lot of first-time managers, it can really be a growth opportunity for them to learn how to have those conversations, to provide the feedback. It also shows them the importance of giving regular feedback along the way, because I'm a big fan of when you have these conversations around performance, merit, that there are no surprises, because there's been this open communication all along the way. So it's already information they know how they're performing, but you're just coming in with more information and more data that supports what the conversation has been like all along the way. And that's difficult, and particularly in our industry of tech, there are a lot of first-time managers that aren't necessarily comfortable, having those conversations. So an investment up front is absolutely worth its weight in gold. Mm-hmm. Jamy, how do you communicate eligibility for merit increases, during this interesting economic period that we're in?
I think from my perspective, if you're an employee that's hitting performance metrics, then you deserve an annual merit increase consideration. If there is a need for an organization to limit eligibility on merit increases, I think it needs to start with the executive team first. And you max out whatever comp savings or adjustments you need to make at the executive level. If that's absolutely not enough and you can't max out your cuts with your executive team and it has to trickle down, then I think it needs to trickle down equally in the same manner. I've been challenged with that line of thinking. Investing more in certain areas of the business can provide higher yields. But when it comes to your annual merit cycle, I don't think that's appropriate. And I think that your turnover costs, I've proven more times than not that your turnover costs, if you do it any other way, end up being higher than the savings you think you would have gotten because of the decision to not treat people equally or, have it along the way, the same philosophy along the way.
It's such a good point. My husband is the CFO of a company that's about 250 people, and they did some analysis recently about the cost of attrition versus the cost of what it would have taken to given pay raises to certain people or people above a certain performance level. And it was in the six figures. Sorry, not six figures. It was in the hundred thousands. Whatever that I think
that's six.
I am in marketing. But yeah, I think it's a really solid point where there's a lot of similar alignment between HR and finance teams for sure. Mm-hmm. Switching gears a bit, Jamy, you alluded a couple minutes ago to the fact that pay inequities do not exist right now, at least according to benchmarking you had from last year, which is, not to overstate, pretty staggering. I would love to understand how you've ensured that pay equity and also during this merit cycle that's starting, how do you support underrepresented employees who, especially during economic seasons like right now, data shows are most susceptible?
So I think this is one of the most critical parts of any compensation leader in an organization, whether that's HR or finance or wherever it falls, if it's comp and benefits. The biggest thing is don't assume anything. Don't assume that the hiring practices are fair. Don't assume that your management teams have been consistent along the way. Don't assume that people understand how their pay is structured or where those numbers come from. Don't make any assumptions. If you're going to look for pay inequity, and especially when it comes to DE&I efforts or underrepresented employees in any way, have solid processes in place to avoid it to begin with. That starts with the hiring process. Make sure that whatever your comp philosophy is, make sure that it is competent and being enforced in that very beginning stages, because that prevents so much of any inequities along the way. Mm-hmm. And if you are in the role of reviewing and approving compensation adjustment requests, whether that's through a merit cycle or outside of a merit cycle, you have a responsibility to ensure that it's being applied fairly and equitably across the organization. I love when I have executives come to me and they've got an employee that maybe is going on maternity leave in 2 months and they want to move forward with a promotion and a large compensation increase anyway, right? Those are some of those situations where executives or businesses can make many different choices and have made many different choices in the past. And so when I see some of those things coming through, that tells me that we're doing the right things and we're supporting a culture in the right way to avoid having those inequities in the future.
That's great. Particularly that reference point and that example. I agree wholeheartedly. And as we are in the new year and thinking about, retaining employees, what are some of the methods that you all will do to, retain your employees in addition to, obviously merit and comp increases?
Like I alluded to earlier, standardizing our performance management practices across the organization is going to be key for us this year as well. We haven't had that in the past, just a product of a growing organization. A lot of different aspects of people leadership was left up to the individual managers to run. And so we're trying to put some structure in place that is through the entire organization rather than having those differences depending on the leader or the department that you're in. And so I think that's important for growing organizations to take a look at. We're also very focused on being an employee-centric workplace, which is really important to us. We want our employees to know without a doubt that we're the employer that they want to work for. And we want them to know that if we're not for any reason along the way, that they can come tell us why not, and we'll have a conversation with them. So that's really important. And then the other aspect is, that career pathway framework that we're working on, helping those managers specifically grow so that those professional development opportunities for growth can trickle down through the entire organization. That's a structure that's important. But again, it's about empowering those managers to have the conversations when needed and appropriately when they come up.
Yeah, and speaking of employee centricity, your company, thanks to the work you're doing, actually won Open Comp's nomination as an employer to watch because of its employee centricity, which was pretty cool. So, yeah, I loved seeing you there. It made me pretty excited.
Me too.
Jamy, one of the things that I have admired about you since we met a couple months ago is just the generosity of your thought leadership and kind of the consistency of your voice in the market. You're a fairly active thought leader. And so this next question is, a bit for our audience and a bit for myself from that lens and just from a broader lens as well. What is doing well at work mean for you as a woman in tech? And maybe there's a gender nuance there, maybe there's not at all. But I'm just curious what that means to you on a personal level.
And ending with just a tough question is the one that we started with, right? I think success for me is being seen by other women in tech as a role model. One of the things that I've learned moving from healthcare HR into the tech industry is that there's just a huge lack of women tech role models. And so if I'm able to influence in a positive way, then I think I'm doing something right. And if people continue to want to hear what I have to say, then I think I'm doing something right. So I aspire to be a woman in tech role model that can help with bridging some of the gap that is there.
Well, congratulations, because I think you're well on your way to achieving that. And lots of very relevant, thoughtful information, was shared today. We always do save this question for the end, and it is actually a favorite question of mine. What in your mind is the most important thing that we've talked about today that the listeners should really remember and take away from this very important and relevant conversation?
I think the not making any assumptions is the most relevant. I think that can be applied to comp, it can be applied to pay transparency, it can be applied to DE&I, right? And across the organization when it comes to relationships, psychological safety, taking away opportunities or removing those opportunities for assumptions to be created or bought in as belief is really important. And the more you can be candid with your conversation, the more transparency you can have, the more you are diligent in how you're approaching things. And if you see something, say something, speak up. I think that's the key. Just by removing assumptions in what we're doing in our daily work, how we're approaching each other. And if we feel like there's something that's not right, let's look at it. Let's talk about it and have those open conversations. So whether that's comp, whether that's career development, career paths, frameworks, doesn't matter. People in general just need to be able to talk to each other in a candid and open way without fear. And that psychological safety that's associated with that will take away a lot of the issues that we continue to run into.
So simply said, but very succinct and clear. This has been a really valuable conversation. Jamy, thank you so much for your time today.
I appreciate it, Caitlin, Nancy. It was a pleasure.
Thank you, Jamy.
It really has been. And to our listeners, don't forget to leave us a 5-star rating. And if you have any ideas for topics or guests, you can email podcast@opencomp.com. Have a wonderful day.
Thank you.
Win top talent while strengthening runway with OpenComp. Thousands of the world's fastest growing companies use our compensation intelligence platform because it offers the most competitive benchmarks and insights available. To learn more, visit app.opencomp.com/signup.